Welcome to the hands-on AWS ELB demo. Now let's just create an ELB. We'll add two instances that belong to different zones to our ELB. We'll figure out how to set up our health check instances. We'll look at the properties of the load balancers. We'll look at the status of the instances once we add them to the load balancer. And then once the instances are up and running behind the ELB, we'll figure out how to access our service using ELB. And then finally, we'll figure out how to remove an instance for maintenance or upgrades or patches, and how to remove a complete AZ from the load balancer. So let's go to the load balancer section of the EC2 dashboard. And right now, as you can see, I don't have a load balancer created in my account. So I'm just going to create a new load balancer by clicking this button. And I'm going to give US West ELB as the name of the load balancer. And in this case, I want to select the VPC that my instances are going to be. And this is the listener port that I can configure. So right now, the load balancer listens on port 80. It's running the protocol HTTP. And backend instances are also HTTP, and it's also running on port 80. I don't have to run the backend instance on port 80. So if that's used by some other service, I can go and configure the backend instances separately. If I want to add another listener, let's say I want to add HTTPS listener, I can go ahead and create that listener, and I can create, if I have a backend HTTPS service, I can select that here as well. Since I don't have a backend HTTPS service, I'm going to get rid of that for now. The next section, I need to select subnets for my service. So right now, even though I have only two instances in US West 2A and West 2B, I'm going to select all of the subnets in case I want to add more instances in the other subnets. So right now I selected all the subnets, and then I'm going to click assign security groups. So I already have one security group that's a default security group. I'm just going to keep that for now. Or I can, if I want to create a new security group, I can go ahead and create one by selecting that link there. So now the next step is to create the health checks. So now it's the ping protocol. My instances are running on port 80. The service is HTTP, and it's looking for a status page. So I'm going to say my status page is status.html. And I can leave it the default. I want a response within 5 seconds from my backend instance. I want this ELB service to check for the presence of this page every 30 seconds. And if it doesn't receive a response after 2 attempts, it should mark this instance unhealthy. And once the instance is fixed, once the issues are resolved, and I want it to get 10 valid HTTP responses back from the instances to make that instance healthy. So this is the default ELB health check. I can leave it here, or I can change the numbers. You have option to go from 2 to 10 for unhealthy, and then 2 to 10 for a healthy threshold as well. And I can change the interval of the checks, or I can change the response time from the instance. So and then the next thing I'm going to do is add the EC2 instances. So it automatically detects that I had 2 healthy instances, US West 2A instance, US West 2B instance. So I'm going to select both of them. I'm going to next add the EC2 instances. It went and detected that I had 2 instances that are running in the account, US West 2A, US West 2A, and US West 2B. So I'm going to select both of them and add that to my ELB. I'm going to create a tag for my load balancer. I'm just going to say ELB, and I'm just going to say US West. This is something for my own information. If you have multiple load balancers, this is the way to organize it. Typically, we name it by the name of the project, the customer name, or the account name, the environment name, whatever you can define, and you can add additional tags if you choose to. But right now, I'm just going to say this is my ELB in US West. I'm going to review my settings. So this is an internet-facing load balancer. That means it does receive a public IP address. This load balancer will be accessible from the internet, which is what I want. and it's looking for status.html on all my instances, and it's looking for a timeout of 5 seconds. Maximum allowed time to get this page is 5 seconds, and I want the load balancer to check every 30 seconds for the presence of this file. The unhealthy threshold is 2 and the healthy threshold is 10. And then it's the security group that I've chosen is the existing security group, and then the tags. I'm going to create the load balancer, and within few seconds my load balancer will be up and running. So now if you look at the screen, this is the description of the load balancer screen. So these are all the AZs are selected and the port configuration, and the stickiness is disabled. So this is a stateless load balancer. So right now it's still adding the 2 instances. So if you look in the next tab over here, the instances tab, you can see I have added 2 instances, US West 2A and 2B instances, but it's still doing those health checks. So if you look if you hover over the status message, it says instance registration is still in progress. So it takes a couple of minutes to complete this registration process. The other tabs we want to check is the health check. So if you want, at any point you want to modify the health check, this is the tab you would come and modify the health check. These are the monitoring tabs. We talked about the number of successful HTTP 200 messages that we received, the 400 messages, HTTP 400 messages we received, 500 messages we received, and right now there's no healthy host reported because they're still being registered. The total 500 errors, there's nothing is still reporting yet now because it's a brand new load balancer. This is the surge queue that we mentioned in the class, and the spillover count, and backend connection. So if you refresh it for a second, the other option we want to talk about while it's still in the process of registering is the security group. This is the group that we selected, and if you want to look at the rules that are applicable to the security group, you can click here and it shows the inbound rules, the outbound rules, and so if you look at the inbound rules, so I'm using HTTP connection, so I'm allowing HTTP connection port 80 to the load balancer. So I'm using the same security group, the default security group, for my instances as well. That's why you would see this SSH rule there. It's of course not applicable to the load balancer. This applies only to our EC2 instances. Let's go back to the load balancer and the listeners that we configured. So if you are at some point you want to add additional listeners, this is where you would come and add additional listeners to your load balancer. And tag, we already have looked at the tag. So let's look at, let's come back to the description. Now I can see both instances are in service. If I click here, the status should say in service. So that means the load balancer was able to successfully talk to the instances. It was able to get those status HTML, and it got a valid return code from my EC2 instances. And now if you look at the bottom of the screen, it says that in my US West 2A, it found one instance there which was healthy. In US West 2B, it found another instance. Since we didn't create any instances in 2C, it's obviously not going to find it, and so it says there's no hosts in that zone. Let's finally look at the description. We'll grab this DNS name for the load balancer. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to just paste it in my address bar. So if I do this, now it says I am US West 2B. So the load, I'm trying to talk to the load balancer, and then it sent the connection to the West 2B instance. Now if I refresh this a couple of times, it will keep changing. Now I got US West 2A. So if I keep going back, it goes back and forth. So we have successfully created the load balancer. We added those 2 instances, and now we are able to access our service using that load balancer URL. And if you refresh it a couple of times, it keeps flipping back and forth. So this is the load balancer. Now if you want to, let's say there's an issue with one of the instances, or you want to take it out of the rotation, it's just a matter of clicking on this button, link rather, remove from load balancer. You just confirm it, and now you have only one instance from the load balancer. So now if I go back to the load balancer tab, and if I click here, I'm going to always, so I had to, some of it is cached. So now if I click refreshing, I'm always going to 2B instance because the 2A instance is out of rotation. And it tells me the status of the instances here. For 2A, there's no instances. There's one instance for 1B. So now I can go ahead and add it. So I can say edit instances, and I can select that, the one instance I just removed. And when I click here, it still has to go through that registration process that we saw earlier. It takes a couple of minutes to make sure the instance is up and running before it starts sending the traffic. Now on the other hand, if you want to remove a complete AZ, you can select this, click this button, edit availability zone. When you click here, you get an option to remove a particular AZ. So let's say now I want to remove, let's say 2B. I can click here, and now that subnet is removed from. I can go ahead and do the maintenance or upgrades, or for all the instances in that AZ. Then when it's when they're back, put them back into service, I basically click back into this add actions, save it. So if I refresh it, the two services should be back in, two instances should be back in service. So now if I go back to my load balancer, now I can talk to both those instances. So this is the end of the demo itself. Now let's go back and summarize what we learned. So in summary, we learned how to create a load balancer in Amazon. We learned how to add instances to the load balancers. We learned how to create the health checks for our load balancers. We looked at the properties of the load balancers. We looked at the description, the instance details, the listeners. We looked at the tags, and we looked at the security group. Then we checked the status of the instances in the load balancer page itself, and we learned how to access the service using the load balancer URL or DNS name. We removed one instance from the load balancer, and then we learned how to remove a complete AZ from the load balancer.